My name's Amanda Keddie. I'm a research fellow at Griffith University, and I'm moving to UQ in a few weeks to take up another fellowship position. I guess we're all aware of the significance of White Ribbon Day and the gravity of the issues that it seeks to raise consciousness about. We're also aware of the alarming statistics associated with violence against women. I guess one of the key things for me about White Ribbon Day was it was initiated by a group of men to support boys and men to speak out about violence against women. So we're here today to recognise the powerful role that men and boys can play in stopping and preventing violence against women. And this will involve, as the aims of White Ribbon Day attest, challenging gendered behaviours and attitudes, talking and speaking out about the issue, and also promoting respectful relationships in terms of gender equality. We want to acknowledge that days like White Ribbon Day are very positive in raising awareness about this global problem and its devastating consequences, but we also recognise that consciousness raising on a single day is far from adequate in addressing these sorts of behaviours and the endemic problem. We require long-term, holistic, structural and cultural change to stop violence against women before it starts. So we want to emphasise today that this problem is a complex problem and it's broad, and it is associated with unequal gender and power relations. We want to focus on identifying and challenging the discourses of power and entitlement that underpin this problem. And we want to locate issues of violence against women within a broader social context where many boys and men feel compelled to take up these discourses as an expression of their masculinity. In my presentation, I want to explore some of the antecedent behaviours to this violence against women by examining these issues in schools, where even young boys, very young boys, are seduced by these discourses. We want to argue, of course, that schools can play a very crucial and central role in addressing violence against women through gender-just education. So I guess the key thing for me is when we're examining issues of gender and power is to ask, what does our society value and promote in terms of successful masculinity? And of course, we all are very familiar with these sorts of images, but the images on the left are associated with a successful or ideal masculinity, while the images of the right on the right would be associated with less desirable masculinities in terms of what the social value of these masculinities. So we can see while physical prowess is a trait that is obviously revered in masculinity, when it's associated with combat and action, as in the slides on the left, it's valued, while when it's associated with aesthetic or grace, it's devalued. We can see obviously that economic status is a desirable masculine quality, and it's constructed in stark opposition to the house husband that we see on the right. And there's also an assumed normal heterosexuality within the discourses that are taken up in the images on the left, while an abnormal, deviant homosexuality is associated with some of the images on the right. And in terms of hierarchy of power, which Martin will talk about in much more depth later, we can describe the men on the left as ascribing to dominant or hegemonic forms of masculinity, while those on the right are subordinated or marginalised. So in terms of a dominant societal view of what's valued, we have the ideal masculinity as being synonymous with power, control, action, strength and autonomy, and this is constructed in opposition to the traits of passivity, dependence, weakness, which are associated with females and the feminine. Now, of course, these discourses are reflected in a much broader level with, as Connell would say, the gender order of society, where males as a group, and we're talking about middle-class white males, tend to be far more economically, politically and culturally privileged than females as a group. Now, as we all know, these sorts of discourses are everywhere. They're such a taken for granted part of our everyday lives that we tend not even to notice them, and often we don't see them as part of the problem in terms of harmful relations of gender and power. they're particularly visible and amplified, of course, within popular culture, where we're bombarded about images that the way we should be and act in terms of our gender. There's obviously countless examples of this, and I'm sure you're all aware of these examples, but a quick scan of GQ magazine seems to, for me, crystallise these discourses of entitlement. I was trying to find actually women on the cover, and there weren't very many women, but in the covers that I did find, you can see how the woman is presented. She's heterosexualised, she's subservient, she's passive and available. So in terms of gender relations, this sort of really crystallises for me those discourses of entitlement that we're trying to problematise. And of course, women are complicit in reinscribing these discourses of masculine entitlement and their own objectification of their femininity and sexuality within that male gaze. A book I've recently read by Ariel Levi called Female Chauvinist Pigs, The Rise of Raunch Culture, talks about a new female identity, which is the female chauvinist pig, who is apparently this empowered woman who wears the Playboy bunny as a talisman and pursues casual sex as if it was a sport. She takes off her bra to win favour from the boys in TV shows like Girls Gone Wild. These are the girls that have grown up on a diet of Paris Hilton, pole dancing and G-strings marketed to prepubescent girls. This diet reflects the pornified aesthetic that Marie Crabb and David Corlett's very engaging paper, Eroticising Inequality, illustrates. They argue that this porn aesthetic has invaded popular culture, mainstream culture, music and entertainment and behaviour, and the porn insignia is now a commonplace sort of symbol of this culture. And many women have embraced this culture as sort of a part of an empowerment. But it obviously remains steeped in inequitable gender stereotypes and misogynistic sexual relations. So it would seem that far from being empowered, these women are reinforcing the discourses of masculine entitlement that actually perpetuate some of these harmful behaviours. So I think we need to always situate these discourses within the broader social context of gender and power. There was a story the other day on one of the morning news programs about a young Australian woman who had got down to the last 100 in a competition auditioning for the NFL cheerleader squad. So there were thousands of women that had auditioned, and it was a positive story about the amount of training, the amount of gymnastics, dance training that went into being a good cheerleader, the amount of hours and the highly competitive ways that these girls were going about this being a cheerleader. So it was a positive story, and it was about its vast and rising popularity with young girls and how cheerleading as a sport in its own right was being taken up by these girls. But then it got to the bit about how much cheerleaders get paid, and she gets, this is for the Dallas Cowboys cheerleaders in the NFL, she gets $150 per game, while he gets a median salary of $1.4 million per year. Now you might say, fair enough, the crowd isn't coming to see her shake her pom-poms, they're coming to see him play the game, play ball. And anyway, she's really happy and getting a lot out of it and, publicly valued, I guess. But that would be dislocating this problem from its broader social context. Despite comparative training in terms of the hours in the gym and the hours of dance training, etc., and his hours of football training, his physical prowess is revered to the tune of $1.4 million, while hers is belittled to the tune of $150 a game. And while there are numerous paid outlets for him to display his physical prowess, there are no such similar outlets for her. And obviously we don't see male cheerleaders cheering on female-dominated sports. And of course, while we might try and value cheerleading in its own right, which I think there has been a push to, in general, the view of cheerleading is trivial and decorative and always peripheral to the real action. So similarly, the empowered pole dancer with porn star emblazoned on her t-shirt. While she might feel empowered, it's an empowerment that depends on her fitting in with a heterosexual ideal of femininity that most women don't measure up to. Thus, it's an empowerment that is constrained by broader discourses of gender, power and entitlement. And we're all aware, of course, of the costs of these discourses and the way they play out. Certainly sports stars like Brendan Favola and Shane Warne are prime examples of how these discourses are playing out in a very public way. The phenomena of happy slapping, which is the recording of assaults and distributing them electronically via mobile phone or other electronic means, and sexting adds a whole new dimension to this problem. The Lara Bingle issue really illuminates, I guess, and is a case in point in terms of how new technologies are taking this problem to a whole new level in terms of the impact of sexual assault. The recent Australian Defence Force incident is another case in point, where a sexual encounter between a female cadet and a male cadet was filmed or Skyped to another room, unbeknownst to her, to a group of other 6 male cadets to watch. Now, these sorts of incidents are enduring, and they're not new, which is so disturbing, and indeed some of them are sort of taken for granted parts of gender relations. And they're excused often, some of them, as being a harmless bit of fun, like the bumper stickers on the right of the slide are taken as, which is all part really of, I think, a continuum of discourses of entitlement that many boys and men take up. And of course there are costs to men, severe costs to men in terms of taking up these discourses, aside from degrading their relationships with females in their lives and the males in their lives. Of course we know that there's links between these discourses and masculinity and criminality. We're all familiar with the overwhelming predominance of, or the overwhelming representation of males in statistics for incarceration, homicide and of course violence, and violence against women. Now we position these behaviours, of course, as not as somehow a natural part of being a male. Not all men take these behaviours up, or even many men actually explicitly resist these discourses. But we see them as a consequence of the social patterns of entitlement that many men take up in their efforts to ascribe to a masculinity that is synonymous with power, control and entitlement. So like the aims of White Ribbon Day, our book similarly focuses on challenging the gendered attitudes and behaviours that underpin violence. We want to encourage boys to really discuss and talk about issues of masculinity, and we want to promote respectful gender relations. We want to do this in schools early. We think that we should be teaching children at a very young age that this is unacceptable, and we should be exploring these issues with very young children. And it's about stopping violence before it actually starts. We, as many others do, of course, recognise that this is a long-term, we should be adopting, a long-term approach to these issues, and it's about challenging gendered cultures, which is a very enduring part of our social patterning in everyday lives. So it is something that needs to be embedded, we think. And in our book, we try and give an account of teachers who are doing just that in their classroom. Now, these cultures are highly prevalent in schools, and I'm sure you would be aware of that. In the following slides, I just want to provide an account of some of the data that we've collected in schools. Now, none of these insights are new, but they're worth revisiting. The following interchange I'm going to show you is from a study I conducted with a group of boys who are between the ages of 6 and 8 years old from a school in Tasmania, and they're having a conversation with each other about another boy, Brian, in a Year 1 class. So I guess we can see here, and then this is a very familiar patterning of boys' behaviours, and you're probably all aware of it, but in terms of discourses of entitlement, we see that there's a trivialising of femininity, of course, which is it's seductive, very seductive to young boys who are probably positioned as quite powerless in many other ways. So they tend to take up these discourses in schools a lot. So it's a familiar practice to call a boy a girl as a form of insult, effective form of insult. And it's very common in our research. In this next interchange, Adam talks about football and girls. Would you like me to read it? Would that be best? Okay. I like football because you can get really good chicks because they think your butt's cute. You get sexy women, they watch her and then you show off. You have a cute butt and lots of girlfriends if you're playing AFL. Jessica's my girlfriend, yeah? Oh yeah, and Zara Allen, she kissed me in kinder. Oh, and I've had a heap of girls who've kissed me. The A-man always gets the chicks. Yeah, and Matthew too. Matthew would say he's like got 10,000 girlfriends. He can tell more whoppers every day. Yeah, and he says, I've got 32 girlfriends, and then he goes, nah, I got this many, and then he shortens it 1 week, and then next week he 10 times it. So we can see performances of heterosexuality here, and where girls are constructed as commodities, as acquisitions and possessions. In this one, we have Adam talking about particular girls. So he says, Britney Spears isn't too bad, she's okay. Yeah, so which girls are okay and which girls aren't okay? Chubba chubs, cross out. Chubba chubs, what are they? Ooga chaka, oog chaka. Really fat people. Fat girls? So which girls do you like? Thin, sexy legs? Yeah. Often these comments from young boys we've found in our research are kind of seen as cute. They're like boys being adorable little men, especially in little boys, and this is an 8-year-old, and there were 6-year-olds in this group as well. So there's often an affectionate sort of tolerance that's associated with these sorts of behaviours, like boys just being boys. But we argue, of course, that these behaviours are antecedent to later, more aggressive forms of entitlement. Kerry Robertson wrote a really great paper, provocatively called Great Tits Miss, and she says, boys from an early age are aware that accessing hegemonic masculinity privileges them to certain resources and institutionalised power that neither girls nor women will equally share in particular contexts. In schools, boys have learnt that objectifying and sexualising women does work to gain power. In this next excerpt, I'm going to show you, it's a group of Year 8 girls, 14-year-olds. They're also from a school in Tasmania, and they're actually from a follow-up study that I did in relation to the boys. I went back to their school when they were 14 years old to do a follow-up study, and the girls in this slide are their fellow classmates, and they're talking about a group of boys, one of whom is Justin from the previous slide. Like, they try to feel you up. Oh, they just always touch me. Oh, what do you mean? They touch Jane. They always try and touch my boobs. Sorry to be rude, Jane, but yours are bigger than the rest of the girls in the class. So they're like, oh, Jane. That's why. Yeah, all the girls go straight to Jane because she's got the big boobs and nice body and everything. And they're like, Jane can get some and you're so ugly and all this. Yeah, it's just stupid. But like in the morning, you go up and give them a hug and say good morning and that. Well, the guys take it too far and drag Jane down and try and touch her boobs. They're like, oh, hi, Jane, and then, oh, sorry, my hand slipped. And you're like, as if it did. Yeah, they like stick their hand around and then they go, oh, whoops, and you're like, yeah, that was an accident. So these girls actually in our interview talked about a lot of these sorts of sexualised encounters that they had with the boys. And in comparing the slides with the previous slides as 8-year-olds, I can't help but see some sort of escalation in those discourses of entitlement in terms of when they were 8 and now that they're 14. Now, the following snippet is from the same interview, and it's Marie she talks about being blamed for being a distraction to the boys, and she talks about being networked to another class as a kind of disciplinary measure. In Miss H's class, I got networked because I was a distraction to the guys because they kept feeling her up and they kept pushing, like grabbing me by the arm and hugging me and stuff. And I didn't want to, and Miss H networked me as if it was my fault. And I was crying the whole day. I got yellow formed and all and sent to another class. What did she say to you? She just said, I'm not having you in my classroom. You're a distraction. Get out. Did you ask her, did you talk to her about this and complain? No, she just said, get out. And I actually talked to the Year 8 coordinator, who was also the behaviour management kind of teacher, a male, about this. He was aware about the sexual harassment issue and the concerns that the girls had. And his response to me when I broached the topic with him was, oh, those girls can really overreact. And he says, sometimes those girls can be real drama queens. So we can see that such ways of addressing the gender dimensions of bullying often are about dislocating the issue of gender from it. So these are disciplinary measures that are used quite prescriptively sometimes. But what they don't do is they don't address the issues of gender within these behaviours. They blame, trivialise and reinscribe those discourses of entitlement that we were talking about. This is just another interchange in terms of the girls, so that the power that they saw the boys having over them. Also in our work with teachers, we've seen these discourses of power and entitlement undermine the authority of female teachers. Again, these comments are far from atypical, and it tends to be young women that are feeling this most saliently. This one's from a woman, a female teacher from an all-boys school, and she feels dismissed because she's female. I think sometimes the boys are a bit dismissive of you because you're female, and you know, if I was one of the rugby coaches, I can guarantee that I would have very few run-ins with very few boys because they don't want to get on the bad side of the rugby coaches. But yeah, I mean, sometimes you get boys who are a bit dismissive and a bit, I don't know, just a bit anti-you. Another theme we found with female teachers, particularly young female teachers, was they felt under surveillance with these discourses, particularly in terms of their physical appearance and what they wore. This is a snippet from another teacher at the same school. And she says, I'm very conscious about what I wear in front of them. It's nothing tight, nothing low V neck, nothing short. Do you know what I mean? Nothing tizzy, but try and look and act professional in front of them, because I've had people in different schools who don't do that, and the boys don't miss a beat. They talk about, see what Miss has got on, and like, you know, I'm really conscious when I go and buy a pair of trousers or a skirt for work about the underwear not showing through, the old VPL. But, you know, the boys will pick up, you know, she's wearing a G-banger today, Miss. They'll notice it, especially the young females. They notice, they don't miss a beat. So we can see how young female teachers in particular, but all female teachers, feel the impact of these discourses of entitlement that many boys feel compelled to take up. The other key theme that Martin will probably talk in more depth about is the discourses of homophobia or the practices of homophobia that fit within these broader discourses of entitlement. And they police boys' behaviours in terms of what is successful masculinity. And this is a key theme in a lot of our research. So Carmen says, it comes through in machismo, it comes through in homophobia. I'm often hearing comments, those derogatory terms, you know, faggot, gay sort of thing. They use the word gay a lot. Everything's gay or gay is very derogatory, it's a put down. And we're all very, very familiar with these practices. But it's about denigrating the feminine in boys, like calling a boy a girl, calling a boy gay or faggot continues to be an effective insult in terms of policing boys' behaviours and denigrating boys' behaviours. And we know that it legitimises the narrow ideas about successful masculinity presented earlier, where successful masculinity is constructed in opposition to anything resembling the feminine. Okay.
Thanks, Amanda. So what we've seen through Amanda's part of the presentation is the significance of the discourses of misogyny and homophobia, the powerfulness of both of those discourses in terms of constructing both femininities, masculinities, and particular kinds of gendered power relationships. And in all our work with schools, we've tried to stress the importance of tackling both of those kinds of discourses. We have usually managed to be able to put misogyny or sexism on the agenda, less so homophobia. It's one of the discourses that schools have real trouble addressing. I once worked quite closely with a school where there was a student social justice group who were doing some amazing work, and then they wanted to do this this project, and they had posters which argued that homophobia kills, and they set out a whole range of events that had led to young people dying as a result of homophobia. And the deputy principal pulled them aside and said, look, you're doing brilliant, brilliant work, but we don't want you to tackle this. Otherwise, everybody will think this is a gay and lesbian school and won't send their kids here. At the time, it always struck me as if, you know, you were looking for a really safe school to send your kids. If there was a school that was safe for gay and lesbian kids, it was going to be safe for a very lot of people. However, within a current moment where schools are trying to market themselves, any kind of concern around issues such as homophobia, they're not touched within schools. And the same with violence, and I'll say something about that in a moment. But when I was doing a book earlier, I think it came out in 2001, Challenging Violence in Schools, and I wanted to go into schools to see what kind of programs schools were doing. And I remember having this strange conversation with one principal where she just went absolutely silent, and I couldn't tell whether there was somebody on the other end of the phone or not. And then suddenly she said, "You're not coming here to do that. Right? It's not doing, you know, if everybody thinks that, you know, we're doing programs around violence, they'll think this is a violent school." In the end, I managed to talk my way in, but I had to call the project Promoting Supportive Relationships in Schools, and then they were quite happy to deal with it, but they weren't happy to address issues around violence. So what I want to do in this little part of the presentation is talk about the kind of work that goes on to produce masculinities and femininities. As Amanda has indicated from her part of the presentation, it's not as if we have a kind of essential masculinity and essential femininity, a natural way of being. There's a kind of normalising process that goes on that says these masculinities are normal, these femininities are normal. And when people step outside of those roles, often violence kicks into as a policing mechanism. So I want to say something about the policing of masculinities. And the focus here is, in this part, is on the politics of masculinity. And I think that in any intervention with kids in schools, it's this in politics that we have to engage with. Carrie Pachter makes a very nice comment about the way in which kids move into particular groups. She says, "To be accepted as fully masculine in a particular social grouping, one must display certain characteristics and behaviours. Without this, one is not seen fully as a member of a group. Hence, it is not simply a matter of claiming membership of a particular community of masculinity or femininity. One has to be accepted as a legitimate participant by those who are already members." So Amanda set up the kind of notions of successful masculinity. But it's not like there's a smorgasbord of masculinities where you think, oh, I'm going to pick that successful one. I'm going to be the star football player, or I'm going to be, you know, whatever. There is a way in which you are allowed in or forbidden access to certain communities. And it's that politics that I think we have to trouble. One of the interviews I once did was with this kid young boy in grade 9, that I'd been observing their class for close to a term. And this young boy was one of those boys when, I don't know how many of you are teachers or have been teachers, but there's occasional days when there's one kid doesn't come that day and you think, yes, you know, I might actually get some work done today, right? This was one of those boys. And when I interviewed him, it was probably one of the most wonderful interviews I'd done or I'd enjoyed doing. And at the end of the session, he sort of shook my hand, thanked me, and it was kind of like there was this different person that I was talking to from who I'd been watching in class. But in his interview, the work that goes on in terms of maintaining a successful masculinity really comes through. So and I'll read the quotes because I like to know where we're all up to. So Peter says, "I've never been like that, shared my feelings or anything." Oh, we were talking about men sharing feelings and emotions. "It's hard for men to do it because they'll say, 'Ooh, what is he? Is he a bit queer or something else? Or is he a bit of a fag or something?' Some shit like that, I don't think, like in our society, you gotta be for men, you gotta be. Like you gotta be like, you can't be like a little queer, like a little shy, like a little softy sort of thing. You can't be like that. Or people start sussing you out. Ah, shit, this fella looks a bit sus. Stay away from him. Like that, and I don't know. It's just a lot, and a lot of pressure's on and stuff, and I don't know. Oh yeah, and it just wears down the pressure of stuff like that. Men shut their feelings away, and you'll get called a girl, because you see that's what girls mainly do." In that interview, I think you can just see the work you gotta be. Like it's the constant repetition and the powerfulness of those discourses. You daren't be seen to be like a little girl. You daren't be seen to be like a little queer. And this boy made sure in classroom that nobody ever thought that for one moment by his behaviours. And when I went back to re-interview him in the following term, I discovered he'd been suspended and nobody ever really knew what happened to him, and eventually he sort of faded out of the school system. But I think, and you can see where some of that's come from in terms of his performances of masculinity. And you can see the homophobia, and you can see the misogyny that kind of imbues these discourses that Peter's expressing. As I said earlier, we have found it difficult to get into schools to address issues around homophobia, address issues around violence. And at times we've been looking for kind of little ways in. And Maria mentioned it in her introduction, that unfortunately the kind of boys debate that's occurred in Australia has constructed boys as new victims. And schools really want to do boys' issues, but they don't want to touch violence. And I think Amanda and I and other people who worked around boys and violence have found ourselves often being called upon. Can you come and work and show us how we can get boys engaged in literacy, how we can get boys more better engaged in schooling, and I think that we've managed through a kind of sleight of hand to say yes and then go in and do what we really want to do. And the work of Wayne Martino, who at the time was in Western Australia, he did these interviews with boys in his English class. And I've used those interviews a bit in terms of getting into schools to say what we need to do to address boys' engagement with schooling and boys' literacy. And they bring out the kinds of homophobia and misogyny that we would want to be tackling and want to be challenging amongst groups of boys if concerned about violence. And I'll just show you some of the quotes. Oops, I've gone backwards. From that class that Wayne was teaching. These are two grade 10 boys. "I believe that English is more suited to girls because most of the work is about emotions and feelings, and girls are more used to this or have better practice at expressing their feelings. English is more suited to girls because boys like sport, heavy stuff, but girls' personalities are more suited to English because they are usually more on the quiet side than boys." And to use these quotes with teachers and say, look, the problem is here that the things that girls are good at are being devalued in the school. Right? Why are boys saying we don't want to do English because that's what girls do? Right? Why aren't they saying girls do English? That'd be fantastic if we could do that as well. Right? And actually try and say, well, look, there's misogynist discourses at play here. And that's what needs to be challenged within the school. Another boy in that class made this comment to Wayne, who was his teacher at the time. "English is more suited to girls because it's not the way guys think. This subject is the biggest load of bullshit." Imagine being the teacher and being told that. Anyway, "I have ever done. Therefore, I don't particularly like this subject. I hope you aren't offended by this, but most guys who like English are faggots," right? And so what I've said to teachers in schools is like, if there's a classroom with that kind of view of English and engaging in literacy, how many boys in the class are going to go, "Oh, but I like English. I really love it, given the kind of homophobic discourses permeating in schools, the violence often associated with that. So I think that what we've done is try to use these kind of discourses to get in and talk about violence in schools. Why masculinities? And I think I just want to go through a little bit of, theory here to try and say how we talk about these things in schools. And we try to point out, as we've been showing through the kind of homophobic discourses, there's a hierarchy of masculinities. Boys don't just, as I said, access successful masculinities, right? There's a hierarchy that works to privilege some masculinities within schools and to oppress some masculinities within schools, and those have to be challenged. And using Raymond Connell's masculinities framework here, hegemonic masculinities, they're the masculinities incredibly valued within schools. They're the successful masculinities. And to some extent, I have found in schools they're some of the hardest boys to work with. And I think work needs to be done with them. But to some extent, it's this other category, complicit masculinities, that I've enjoyed working with. These are the boys in schools who reap the benefits of a system that's geared towards supporting boys. However, they're the boys who rarely are violent. They themselves will sit by the side, maybe participate in harassment of other boys and girls, but rarely instigate it. But much of the violence that occurs within schools occurs because some people sit aside and say nothing. And it's that whole notion of the importance of encouraging kids to take some responsibility for what's going on in their schools. And some wonderful programs around, it's probably sidetracking, but I was talking to some teachers who were involved in that Peacemakers program in schools that's done wonderful work around encouraging kids to step in. Subordinate masculinities, and I'll say more about each of these in a moment, they're the kind of masculinities that are seen as being maybe gay, maybe being effeminate, whatever that term means, but don't cut it in terms of a masculine figure. Often wear glasses, don't like sport, and so on. Then there's a group of boys who sometimes actually perform what appear to be quite successful masculinities, but are often marginalised because of their race or their class. So, for instance, you could be a superstar rugby league player on your in your school, rugby team, but because you're Aboriginal, when you're walking home, you get picked up by the police, or you go home to difficult living conditions. So in terms of talking about boys and talking about how we address issues of masculinity and violence, we need to be aware that there's different sets of boys within schools and a politics which prioritises some kind of boys over others. Huge numbers of studies have been done of boys in schools and have categorised groups of boys. For instance, Connell's study, Cool Guys, Swats and Wimps, Walker's very famous Australian study, Louts, Legends, Greeks, Footballers and Three Friends. The Three Friends was a little group of boys who were so scared of going out into the playground that they spent the whole lunchtimes on their own in the library doing the school magazine. Wayne Martino's, again, this is in Western Australia, Cool Boys, Party Animals, Squids. Squids were people who studied hard, and Poofters. And one of the things, and we'll do it in the workshop session, we'll talk about it, is that I've done with schools is say, if you want to address issues around boys in schools, whether it be with violence, whether it be with some other issue, you can't just talk about boys, you can't homogenise boys. Let's think about the different kinds of groups of boys in your schools and work with that as a construct. Now, what is interesting, I think, around the notion of... I took my watch off, so Maria, can you tell me when it's sort of about 5 minutes to go? In terms of hegemonic masculinities, often it's the assumption that it's kids who are really tough, very good at particular kinds of sport, and often seen as being... linked into a kind of working class masculinity almost. And I just want to show you an interview quote from one of Australia's most elite boys' school. And in that interview, we were talking about the kids who fitted in and didn't fit in. And we get a real sense of this notion of hegemonic masculinity from this boy's comments. And he talked about a boy who'd left the school. I mean, there was one little problem with a boy. They all used to call this boy Ralph because he had a high voice, like in The Simpsons, who had a lot of trouble at the school. And some guys didn't make it extremely easy for him, but he often brought it upon himself, you know. He just didn't really fit in. He's gone now. He didn't have many social skills sort of things and didn't sort of take part in any activities, you know. But yeah, he made some sort of comments that no one really appreciated and didn't get on extremely well with any people. But yeah, no, he's gone. I think he's very happy now, you know. The things we could say about that, you know. I think he just didn't quite adjust to, and he didn't like the competition. He wasn't hugely intelligent, and he found the work very tough, and it's a bit of a shame, but there's a competitive environment at this school. It's quite tough. They've got a lot of students out there wanting to do very well, and a lot of smart people out there. So, you know, I don't think he handled that too well. So here, like in this, what's interesting is in the whole boys debate, it's this notion of boys, you know, aren't doing very well at school. They don't want to be seen to be working hard. They don't want to seem to be achieving. In particular, some contexts, it's very important to be seen to be doing very well, and to be, and it's in those privileged contexts where it's a kind of you know, academic muscularity, if you like, you know, that I'm tougher than you because I'm achieving well. Then there's complicit masculinity, and that's that kind of stepping aside. And I've got some interview quotes here which I'm going to skip over. But as an example of that, I remember, and given that we're moving up to state of origin time in Queensland, I was having this conversation with this boy about why is it that, you know, that men won't engage to support gender justice for women, or won't tackle issues of discrimination. And he said, look, you know, I believe in equal rights for women, but really, until a woman can go on a rugby league field and take a hit up from Glenn Tallis, who was some rugby league player, right? You know, we can't really have equality. And I looked at this grade 9 of about 4'2" and thought, you on the rugby league field wouldn't be able to take a hit up from Glenn Tallis any more than I would, and it was kind of like this notion, because these group of, you know, hegemonic, if you like, men can do this, all us other men benefit, right, without having to do anything. And to me, that picked up on the notion of complicit masculinities. It was that we're better because, you know, we run faster than women, you know, as Kathy Freeman can prove. You know, like a whole range of those kind of projections. Subordinate masculinities, and probably this is where violence amongst boys often kicks in. This was a boy I was interviewing who'd been got into a fight, and I asked him why he'd been in a fight. And he says, look, I was just teasing, so I got sick of it and just hit him. That was a stupid question, but anyway, did that feel better? Did things change after it? Yeah, they did, yeah. And how did people react around you? It wasn't really important to me, but everyone took a step back and thought, whoa, because I wasn't usually like that. I'm just sort of, yeah, it really surprised heaps of people. But I didn't really do it for that. I just did it because I didn't see any other way to stop it. And so many boys talk about this, that they get in fights and they get in kind of all sorts of trouble because they saw no other way out. Many deputy principals I've spoken to have talked about the fact that often parents will say to boys, just hit him and it'll all be finished. You know, like, so there's a whole range of discourses around fight back and all will be fine. Marginalised masculinities. I was at a little primary school, very multicultural, and talking to boys and girls about the kinds of way in which kids got on in the school. And these group of girls were talking about this boy, Mark, who was constantly being bullied and called Ching Chong Man, China Man, because he had a Chinese background. But it seemed that it was both the Chinese background and the fact that he was quite good at school that led into his marginalisation. These girls were saying, he works at grade 8 level, hardly anyone likes him. Most people don't understand him, like when he talks fast and quiet, he's nice, he's friendly, he doesn't call you names, he doesn't swear. In fact, the girls like him because he doesn't do all those things. And he gets picked on by some of the boys. Like one says, I hate you, I hate you. And what do they hate about him? They hate that he always gets good marks and they don't, right? But this boy, to some extent, from this you don't get the sense of the trauma that this young kid faces every day at school. And this is Mark now. When I was away, these other two boys took stuff from my desk, like my scissors, my pencil case, and they fart on my dictionary, and they wrecked my calculator, got ripped apart, and I got another one, and they smashed that. There's that constant kind of pressure on that kid because A, he's good at school, and B, because he comes from a non-mainstream ethnicity. And it's those politics, I think, that have to be addressed in school. Those politics of marginalisation, subordination, hegemony, and complicity in the particular power relationships that really have to be tackled. I think what we've done through this presentation can be quite depressing because it shows you the kind of amount of pressure on kids, the entrenched nature of many of these discourses. And when we were doing our book, we had what we thought was a wonderful title that was subtitled, and it was called Practices of Persistence and Hope. And the publisher says, oh, I hate it, and put a line through it. He said, nobody will Google that, right? And the next day I actually read an article about how Google had killed the book title, right? But what we wanted to try and say was in that title was there are no easy fixes, that any kind of change has to involve persistence, and it has to involve some elements of hope. And I just want to finish with a slide that I've compiled from the work of Raewyn Connell. And in her work, she's argued and tried to talk about why is it that men may give up their privilege, may give up what she refers to as the patriarchal dividend, in order to challenge violence in schools, which benefits many boys. So what she says is, and these are things for us to keep in mind in any work we do with boys in schools, that even those who benefit from an unjust system can recognise the oppressiveness of that system. I imagine many of us in this room who are, those of us who are white, are concerned about issues around Indigenous affairs in Australia, concerned about the way the attacks on multiculturalism within Australia, that people do have the capacity to challenge unjust systems, that gender injustices affect women that men are close to and that boys are close to, and they have, as she says, a relational interest in tackling those injustices. The French philosopher Michel Foucault says everything is dangerous, and I would suggest that this is a possibility within this discourse. Like, I think the point is well made, and those people with daughters, with mothers, partners, who are concerned about gender injustices, obviously, often want to tackle those. But if you look at some of the discourses that we're at, for instance, the Cronulla riots, where men were out there to protect their women from the Lebanese men on the beach, you know that discourse can be taken up in problematic ways. She also makes the point that some heterosexual men are also injured by the present system. Like I've interviewed boys who, don't identify as gay, but are constantly being oppressed because they're assumed to be gay, because they don't fit particular kinds of masculine stereotypes. Again, everything is dangerous, and I would be careful of some of those discourses that are in schools and elsewhere, that men are the new victims and white heterosexual men are the new victims, and aren't we, you know, and that they go out and to the bush and dance around trees in their underpants, you know, that kind of masculinity, kind of getting in touch with themselves and looking at their own harms. But I think, again, that the point is well made, that as Amanda indicated some of her statistics, that the maintaining the patriarchy has casualties amongst both men as well as women. That change is inevitable, and that, you know, and that men have to change with the times, and to some extent there are evidence of that change at the same time as the backlash. And I think, you know, we've all been aware of various terms. What was the sensitive new age guy was a term to try and, you know, to ensure that men didn't change. I think it was part of a backlash discourse. And finally, that, you know, that as all human beings, men are capable of caring for others. And whilst I do think there are some problematics, as I said, with the way in which those discourses can be taken up, I think that what they do is say, as the White Ribbon campaign is, you know, hope to demonstrate, is that it is an issue that men can care about. It's an issue that men are involved in, and it's an issue that boys and men can be involved in, and it's critical that men and boys become involved in a campaign to end violence. And those of us who work with schools and with teachers and with student teachers all, you know, have possibilities, I think, for putting this on the agenda. Thanks.
Thanks, Martin and Amanda.